We are on the edge of the next era of Yu-Gi-Oh! The next anime series is being teased, alongside another simplified version of Yu-Gi-Oh! Called Rush Duels. But more importantly, April 1st marks the implementation of the new Master Rule, colloquially, Master Rule 5. This removes the restrictions on special summoning Fusion, Synchro, and Xyz monsters from the extra deck. Today we will be looking back at how those restrictions fundamentally altered the game, and even more impressively, shaped entire playstyles. As a quick note, let's refresh the effects of Master Rule 4. Master Rule 4 encompassed several changes to the game. A new summoning method was introduced with Link monsters, along with 2 specialized zones called the Extra Monster Zones, and a few rules detailing Link states. We also see the removal of dedicated pendulum zones, instead replacing the outermost 2 spell and trap card zones. These are relatively small changes compared to the extra deck summoning restriction. Extra deck monsters can only be special summoned to the player's extra monster zone, or to a zone which is pointed to by a link arrow. Immediately, there is a jump in complexity, which does make the placement of monsters into zones more meaningful. There were even murmurings of cards like Senate Switch seeing play to move around monsters, freeing up zones for special summoning. On a superficial level, this is a huge complexity spike, as it affects every earlier Master Rule. On some level, this may be argued to have increased the skill ceiling, as there are more things to consider when executing a combo, and there exist new positional advantages and disadvantages. To me, there seems to be a conflation with complexity, which is always a barrier to entry for new players, and depth, which is most rewarding for experienced players. More often than not, the difference between complexity and depth is meaningful choices, and for the first time, a Master Rule dramatically reduced player choice. Master Rules 1 through 3 introduced Synchros, Xyz, and Pendulum summons, along with other small changes. Each Master Rule offered a more generic summoning method, which in turn offered greater choice in deck construction and during gameplay. Link monsters were even more generic, accepting most any type of monster as material. But unfortunately, the link arrows affected the other extra deck monsters, being forced to invest cards into link arrows before making a play or pushing tempo with boss monsters. Hyper Synchro decks in particular struggled to get out the material for monsters like Shooting Quasar Dragon. Worse yet, this disproportionately advantaged a few decks. Zodiac could easily invest resources into a single Trident. On top of this, Mrs. Radiant allowed play to be extended. Mistar Boy also empowered Paleo Frogs, but the 2 elemental cards point out the terrible release schedule of Link monsters. It would have made more sense to print the 6 elemental Link 2s in the introductory set, alongside lots of options for every Link position and each Link rating. Obviously, the initial wave would be weaker, but not so exclusionary. And exclusive really is the word to focus on, as for the first time, players were required to purchase cards to play their existing cards. With the beginning of each era, there are always a few pushed cards to facilitate the new mechanic, causing a price spike in the secondary market and increasing the barrier to entry at the competitive level. But being forced to play a Link monster in your Tech Genis deck created a stumbling block for every level of play. Of course, this led to a mass exodus, players quitting the game or just ignoring the Master Rule entirely. Loss of the player base is never good, since players are the most important part of any multiplayer game. But let's take a step back for a second and look at what I think the introductory Link monsters were supposed to do. I see 2 design goals: depower pendulum strategies and slow down the game. Moving pendulum scales to the main spell and trap zones means that there is a trade-off between back row and scales, plus only allowing for a single monster to be pendulum summoned from the extra deck, without Link monsters solved the pendulum problem of special summoning 5 monsters every turn, pretty much for free. So that's a check on limiting pendulum power, and this sentiment is somewhat confirmed as the summoning restrictions have not changed in that regard. As far as slowing down the game, it was largely a failure. Wave after wave of pendulum monsters and supporting main deck cards continuously increased the length of combos, so much so that end-of-match procedures had to be implemented. The sheer number of summons available to players even led to one-turn formats. Turn 1 formats, with numerous unbreakable board decks and even FTK decks. That about covers my qualms with the Link era, from increasing complexity, limitations on deck building, increasing the barrier to entry by borderline requiring Link monsters in the extra deck, and increasing the speed of the formats through the entire Link era. But where do we go from here? Some of the Link enabler cards have been hit on the ban list, but the Link monsters have been holding back a torrent of extra deck summoning, and the floodgates are about to open. April brings interesting times.